tonight because over the past few months, Rick and I've been talking. If you were here a couple months ago, you remember Fabian. He came here to talk to us about Scrum and how Scrum is a game of poker, not really chess. We're hedging bets. After that, Fabian stuck around. We spoke a little bit about it because Fabian also, besides being a Scrum trainer, is also a Scrum at Scale trainer. And as I've always promoted, I want us to think about more than just the things that we're used to hearing and seeing about. There's a whole lot of other agile stuff out there in the world. And part of what Rick and I like to do is to bring people here who are very knowledgeable, very experienced, okay, who are very much about giving back to the community and come in and share what they've, been blessed by the universe back with the rest of us. And so again, Fabian has agreed to come talk to us, but not about Scrum, but Scrum at Scale. So I'm not going to give it away. I've kind of got a little bit of it drawn over here. Scaling is not about hurting your head. And so with that, I'm going to give back the desktop to Fabian. And please, Fabian, take us away.
Thanks, Marcelo. Thanks, Rick. So let me share my screen. And thanks to all of you for taking the time. So yeah, as Marcelo said, I would like to talk a little bit about Scrum at Scale today. And actually, I would like to start not directly by talking about Scrum at Scale, but about the challenges that you are likely to face when you scale, when you try to scale. And then the second part of the talk is a little bit comparing some scaling frameworks, at least the most well-known frameworks. And then the last part is an introduction to Scrum at Scale. Okay, so what you see here on the right is the very first Scrum at Scale guide released in January 2018. So the guide itself is pretty new, but the ideas behind that are not that new. So yeah, let me maybe introduce myself a little quick. My name is Fabian Schwartz. I'm native German. I started working as a project manager. My first project was in 2000 in Berlin, Germany, working or developing software for the financial service sector. And I worked many years as a traditional project manager. Actually, I'm a PMP, I'm PMP certified. I was the head of a project management office for a couple of years. And after a while, I moved from Germany to Australia, and then subsequently to South America. Right now I'm in Bogota, Colombia, and I'm responsible here for the Scrum network. So I basically work through the whole Americas from Canada to Argentina for the Scrum network. What we do is basically training, coaching, and consulting on Scrum. If you want to know more about me, feel free to connect on LinkedIn. There you have all my data, my whole profile. So let's start straight with what's the big problem in scaling, what we call the holy grail of scaling. When we started working with Scrum years ago, and we wanted to convince a company to try Scrum, we entered into a meeting, we talked about Scrum, and we tried to convince them to do a pilot project or pilot Scrum team, 1, 2, 3 pilots. And many of them didn't even know what Scrum is. So the challenge there was to let us try an experiment with 1 Scrum team or maybe 2 or 3. Right now, when we go into a client, most of them already have several Scrum teams or have tried several times to implement Scrum. And their major or main question is, okay, so how do I do that at scale? Some of you might have read Jeff Sutherland's book, Scrum, The Art of Doing Twice the Work in Half the Time, which is basically the nice way of saying 400% performance improvement. So according to Jeff, that's what you can get on average if you implement Scrum well. But imagine like you have 1 pilot team, you started Scrum, okay, you did it very good, buy the book, and you get your 400% performance improvement. So now you have performance X, let's call it performance X in your team. Now, when you add a second team, what performance do you expect now? What do you say? You have performance X in one team. What do you expect if you add a second team?
2x.
2x, right?
Yeah. I'm going to say 800%, Fabian.
So, well, at least that's what you expect, right? 3 teams, 3x, 4 teams, 4x. That's what we call linear scaling. Now, the reality is you get probably 1.2, 1.3, 1.4x, or even worse. But let's see why that is happening. And let's try to use another example that in IT industry is very, very common. That is called Moore's problem. But let's talk first about Moore's law. Somebody knows what Moore's law is? You heard about that? Moore's law? Anyone? Well, if not, so Gordon Moore, the guy that founded Intel, once said the number of transistors on a chip doubles every 18 months. So that means in hardware, every 18 months, you double the hardware capacity, which should also double your performance, right? Now, this would be true if there wouldn't be what's called Moore's problem. Now, let's say you take a laptop from the year 2000, and then you take a laptop from the year 2008. So by then you should have probably almost 16 times higher performance in terms of hardware. But do you think if you take a comparable software, let's take Microsoft Office 2000 on a laptop year 2000 and Microsoft Office 2008 on a laptop from 2008, do you really think you have 16 times the performance? They actually did a test on that, and you obviously get a performance improvement, but it was more like twice as much. So why does this happen? I think everybody knows, because software gets more complex with time. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger and more complex and heavier. And the same happens in your company. So if you have one Scrum team, it's like one transistor on a chip. Now you add a second Scrum team. This is your hardware. In that case, people are the hardware. Now, what's your software? What runs your laptop, what runs your company is your bureaucracy. Because when you have 2 transistors or 2 teams, you have to coordinate them. And in a company, you coordinate teams by talking to each other. Communication, processes, or bureaucracy. Now, this is obviously a problem, because if with bigger software you get slower, whereas with more people and more bureaucracy, you also get slower. And you can't avoid bureaucracy when you put more people into the equation, because you have to coordinate them. Otherwise, they would all run in different directions. So the basic problem is here, what we want is linear scaling. With 2 teams, we want 2x performance. But in order to coordinate those teams, we need bureaucracy. But what we need is something that we call minimum viable bureaucracy. So we need some bureaucracy, but it has to be an absolute minimum to just make sure that teams are coordinated, because every little part of bureaucracy that we add, well, it takes time away that the team is not really working or developing. I think until here you more or less get the problem, the real issue behind scaling. So that leads me to what we usually use as the rules of scaling. Now the first rule is, in a series, don't scale. You might say, well, that's ridiculous. We're talking about scaling and you say don't scale. Well, yes, but you have to understand it's not always necessary to scale. So for example, let's say you have 3 Scrum teams and they work on 3 completely independent different applications. You don't need a scaling framework, or let's say you don't need bureaucracy over those teams in order to coordinate them. Just let them do their job. Now, if that isn't possible because you have 3 teams or 4 teams or 100 teams working at the same product, then the second rule would be remove dependencies between teams wherever you can. If you can get the dependency close to 0, it's almost if you wouldn't scale, like the second best approach to scaling. Now, once you have done that and you still need coordination between teams, well, then do scale. Okay. But I found like many clients are very obsessed with the scaling framework they use. So it's all about SAFe, it's all about less, it's all about Scrum at Scale, it's all about Nexus and what all of those other names. But I think it's very important that you understand that those frameworks are basically tools that you use. And you can compare that to buying a car. You can have a really good tool. You can buy a Ferrari, which is a pretty good car. But if you don't know how to drive, the Ferrari is useless to you. And the same is true for the tool. If you don't know what you actually want to do with that tool and how the basic idea behind the tool works, the tool is useless to you. So what I think is important in scaling is to understand that scaling is basically an optimization game. So when we scale, we not only have one team where we just put the Scrum guides and teach them Scrum, and then we do Scrum in one team. Now we have a complete system. We have to have a more holistic way of looking at things, of looking at the whole system. Actually, a company, you could call a company a system. So the 4 points that you want to optimize in your company between the teams are those 4 points. The reason I'm talking about this is because I would like that you are able to walk out here and can make yourself a decision about all the other scaling frameworks, about the frameworks I will talk here, but also about any other scaling framework, and make a decision, okay, this framework would work in my context, or maybe it wouldn't. So the 4 points that we are usually trying to optimize are those 4 points. The first one is communication saturation, which basically means that you have all the information necessary in order to do your job. Or let's say that everybody has the information he needs to do his job. So what we want is a very high communication saturation. There are lots of there's lots of research out there that shows that high communication saturation leads to very high team performance. So we obviously want high communication saturation. But that creates a problem because the best way to do that is letting everybody talk to everybody and make sure everybody does, which creates lots of communication channels. But remember, the moment you are talking to somebody else, you're not working, like you're not producing. You need that to coordinate, but you're not actually producing. So we would like to have a high communication saturation, but we still want low communication or a few communication channels. We don't want a lot of communication channels, because if we have lots of communication channels, then we spend too much time communicating. Now the third thing we want to optimize, in the last talk actually we had here, I was talking a lot about decisions and decision latency. So what we want to make sure is that decisions are made very fast. That is because of a research from Standish Group that found out that the #1 factor that causes projects to fail is decision latency. It means they need long time to make a decision. So we want communication saturation high, we want few communication channels, and we want a very low decision latency. In other words, we want very fast decisions. And there are some structures that would actually permit that. For example, a military hierarchy could actually do that, but that is a problem, because then the fourth point we want to optimize is degree of separation. So let's say you're in the army and you're a soldier and you want to talk with a general. Like, rarely you do that directly. You do that through the ranks. So you have probably to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 degrees of separation in order to communicate with a general. And the same can happen in a company. Like, the question is, how many of you can directly talk to the CEO, president of a company, if you work in a company with 100,000 people? Well, some can, but on many occasions they can't. And on many occasions they have lots of hierarchies between them, which basically causes what we call degrees of separation. And in order to have an idea, I don't know if you've heard about the theory that everybody is separated from everybody else in the world by 6 degrees of separation. Have you heard that? Anybody heard that? Okay. So, for example, I'm separated by 6 degrees from the Pope, or from the President of the United States, or from the German Chancellor, or from whatever person in the world. Separation to get there. Now, if you have 6 hierarchies in your company, it's basically the same as trying to talk to the CEO of your company is trying to talk to the Pope, because of the degrees of separation. So what we want is, we want to minimize that. And if you look at these 4 points, you can see that they're contradicting. One point is contradicting another point. So you can't just try to get very high communication saturation, but at the same time have very low communication channels. So at the end, what you try is to get to an optimum. So there's no one solution here. This is important, and you can't or it's impossible to only focus on one, because if you sacrifice the others, you won't have 400% performance improvement, and you won't have linear scaling in your company. So that just as an introduction. If you want to know more about that, I could recommend my book. There's a chapter about scaling where I talk a little more in detail about how that would work. But let's talk about scaling frameworks, because many people ask about scaling frameworks. This is a statistic from the Age of Agile report. They did some research on what are the most used scaling frameworks in the world. Okay. So the number 1 scaling framework in terms of usage is SAFe, Scaled Agile Framework, 30% of usage. Okay, 19% is basically people that don't know what framework they're using. Number 3 with 16% is Scrum of Scrums, what we call today Scrum at Scale. Then Disciplined Agile. We also have here what I've listed on the right, 8% with internally created methods. And the most famous internally created method is probably the Spotify model. Pretty sure at least some of you have heard about the Spotify model. And then we have less with 3%, and then Enterprise Scrum, and then lots more frameworks. So what I would like to do is, I would like to look at those frameworks from the following point of view. We want to optimize those 4 points we have seen before. And what we basically want is minimum viable bureaucracy. So the heavier a framework is, the easier it is probably to implement, because it gives you an exact recipe on how to implement it. But the performance improvement that you will get is way below what you actually could get. I actually go and said Spotify Schwartz, that's the Spotify model. So let's talk about SAFe. So actually, before I started to scale different companies, to help client scaling, I studied scaling quite a bit. So my opinions here, obviously my opinions, they are subjective. So that's my opinion. But I've seriously invested time in studying those different frameworks. And usually I tried to study them at the source. So for example, SAFe, I studied directly with Dean Leffingwell, the person that invented it, and the same is true for the other frameworks. Because I believe when one person tells something to another person, to another person, to another person, to another person, the degrees of separation, the information gets messed up. Okay. So this is SAFe. I'm not going into detail because it's about Scrum at scale. But if you look at this, just here in the middle, this is not the very last version, it's actually the one before. So it's still a little bit less full than it is right now. But if you just see the picture, do you think this is a very lightweight framework or this is a very heavy framework?
It looks heavy just by looking at the picture.
It looks a little heavy, right?
Yeah, because you see all the different channels and communication.
Yeah, so it definitely is. So it doesn't mean, you have to understand that nothing of this is good or bad. It just, you have to understand what you want to do. So if what you want is a recipe that tells you exactly each step you need to do in order to implement something, you need something heavy because recipes come heavy, they come with each step. Now, this is then easier to implement, but the downside is your performance is not 2x, it's probably 1.2x or something like that. Now, Disciplined Agile was acquired last year by the PMI, and they start now they certify under the PMI umbrella. We're not sure yet. We are still observing what the PMI and they're doing. We're not really sure where this is going. So right now, I'm not going to comment on that until we are sure. But just Disciplined Agile is one of the major frameworks. And then we have the Spotify model. Okay, and I've seen here several comments. So at least some of you are familiar with the Spotify model. So let me tell you two things about the Spotify model. And both things come from Henrik Nieberg himself. Henrik Nieberg is the person that implemented Scrum in Spotify. And Henrik Nieberg first says the Spotify model doesn't exist because what actually exists is a video called Spotify Engineering Culture. And there they explain how they did scale at that point in time. And some good consultants took that and sold it as a Spotify model. And second, if you ask Henrik, he says, not even Spotify applies the Spotify model. But let's do the following thing. This is just a very short video, 1 minute. Let's hear from Henrik himself what he's saying about the Spotify model.
Hi, I'm Henrik. I'd like to talk a bit about the Spotify engineering culture video and how it relates to the Scrum at scale model. I've worked for over a decade with Jeff Sutherland, and while he was evolving the thing that later on came to be known as Scrum at scale, I was deep in the trenches at Spotify helping to develop their scaling approach. As we co-trained, we spent a lot of time sharing knowledge, and as a result, some of the scaling patterns we used at Spotify got codified into Jeff's model. For example, the executive meta Scrum maps to what we at Spotify called strategy days, a recurring event where a bunch of leaders and stakeholders get together to align around a set of strategic priorities, or bets as we call them. The Agile practice maps to our first Agile Guild, where Agile coaches get together to support, train, and coach each other, and figure out how to take the culture to the next level. We use tools like the health check model to visualize progress and guide the improvements. Executive Action Team in Scrum at Scale maps to the POCLAC model that many tribes used. POCLAC is a cross-section of the tribe, including product owners, chapter leads, and Agile coaches. They would get together on a regular basis to solve tribe-level impediments. But the most important connection to Scrum at Scale is the focus on delivery. Pretty much all our improvement efforts were oriented around enabling teams to move fast, to ship software as frequently as possible with minimum pain and overhead. Speed is really worth emphasizing. I'm currently on the Minecraft development team at Oyang. We have 90 million active users. And I think one of the most important success factors is the fact that we roll out a new snapshot release every week. This gives us really fast feedback, which translates to agility and fast product improvement. For the team, releasing is kind of like a forcing function for collaboration, because with weekly releases, we just don't have time for much bureaucracy or waste. Anyway, thanks for listening, and good luck with your own journey.
Okay, so what he's basically saying is they applied some techniques in Spotify, and those techniques are in the Spotify engineering culture video. And several of these techniques actually ended up in Scrum at Scale. So if you want the modern version of that and the more complete version of that, Scrum at Scale is probably the way to go.
Huh.
And now I also reviewed LESS a little bit. This is Craig Larman. What you see in the background is a systems analysis diagram. So LESS is basically, LESS is based on systems thinking. If you want to know more about systems thinking, there's a pretty good book. It's called The Fifth Discipline by Peter Senge. And if you look here on the right at LESS, this is the LESS huge framework. It is already a little bit more light, I would say, compared to SAFe. But let's see what else we can do. If it's possible to have even something that is even lighter. So this is not a part where I would like to talk about Scrum at Scale. And I said the first guide was released in 2018 in January. But actually the first application was in IDX. I'm not sure that was in the 90s, in the late 90s. And IDX, what now is GE Healthcare. And from then on, Jeff Sutherland and his team, they scaled lots of different Scrum teams using their own technique, basically using Scrum to scale Scrum. But like people, well, if you would ask Jeff actually before Scrum at Scale, how you scale Scrum, he would say, well, that's very easy. You just use Scrum to scale Scrum. Now, the problem is, that might be common sense for Jeff Sutherland, but for most of us that are not Jeff Sutherland, it might not be that common sense. So that's the reason why we got all those scaling frameworks. And obviously Jeff Sutherland also saw that problem. So in 2017, he basically sat down with his team all year long, and they got all the cases they had, and they tried to take patterns from the way they scaled. And that led to the first version of the Scrum at Scale guide. Then they invited a group of us to Boston, and over a week in January 2018, we were working at the Scrum at Scale guide, to helping him basically review the guide. And at the end of that week, we published this version. This is, well, by now we already have a newer version that is even better. But as you can see, like the Scrum at Scale guide is new, but the ideas behind Scrum at Scale, they are not that new. They are actually quite old, if you want. Now, what is Scrum at Scale and how does it work? So this is basically the whole framework. There's nothing more to it. This is the Scrum at Scale framework. Those are all the elements. Let me try to explain you a little bit the ideas behind it. How do you scale? So the basic idea of Scrum at Scale is still Scrum. So the basic element of Scrum at Scale is still one Scrum team. So what do you see here? I'm sorry. Let me get a pointer. What you see here is one Scrum team with one Scrum Master and one product owner. Now, when you scale the team, you create what we call in Scrum at Scale a Scrum of Scrum, which is basically a team of teams. So there are several people that think the Scrum of Scrum is a kind of a daily Scrum at a scaled version. But the Scrum of Scrum is simply a number of several Scrum teams, usually of up to 5. And once that gets bigger, then you have a Scrum of Scrum of Scrum. And then you have a Scrum of Scrum of Scrum of Scrum, and you can scale that almost infinitely. Okay. So that's how you would scale the team. You basically have Scrum of Scrum teams, Scrum of Scrum teams, and you continue doing that. Now, how do you scale the Scrum Master? Now, if one Scrum team has a Scrum Master, a Scrum of Scrum team has a Scrum of Scrum Master. And this is usually just one of the Scrum Masters taking on that role. So you don't have to hire an additional person to do that. And also you can scale that to the Scrum of Scrum Master, Scrum of Scrum of Scrum Master, Scrum of Scrum of Scrum Scrum Master, etc., etc. Only at the highest point, at the highest level of the company, when you reach the top of the company, you reach something what is called the Executive Action Team. So this is the group of executives that is responsible for the Scrum transformation or for the Agile transformation. So they're basically doing the job that the Scrum Master does at the team level, only that they do that on a company level. So they make sure the company uses Scrum, they resolve impediments on a company-wide level, and that's what they do. Obviously, there's a little bit more detail to that, but that's how you scale the Scrum Master. The same thing you can do with the product owner. So each team has a product owner. So each Scrum of Scrum has also a product owner, only that we call it the chief product owner. Now, if you want to think about the chief product owner, to be consistent with Scrum, like it's one product owner per product. So the real product owner in this constellation is the chief product owner. So this would be actually a product owner, and those would be sub product owners, but that sounds not so nice. So we call this the chief product owner, and those guys on the teams help those chief product owner with his work in the team. And you can continue doing that. So you scale, then you go to the chief product owner, the chief product owner, etc., etc., etc. And that also has a top level, and we call those top level the executive meta scrum. So the executive meta scrum is basically the highest level product owner. It's usually in that case a group where the CEO or the senior vice president is part of the group, and they tell us where the company is going. So they tell us what the north is, what's our vision, what's our mission, what are we going to do, what is the portfolio we are trying to develop this year or next couple of years. So this is how you scale the roles. It's not difficult, and you can basically extend that to whatever level you want. The interesting question is usually how you scale events. And because of the time, we cannot enter into each level, but let's talk about how you scale the daily Scrum. So first of all, the scaled version of the daily Scrum is called the scaled daily Scrum. So it would be the scaled daily Scrum of the Scrum of Scrums, or the scaled daily Scrum of the Scrum of Scrums, etc. Now, we found that if we talk about 2 or 3 teams, then sometimes the client gets nervous and says, well, yeah, 2 or 3 teams is nice, but we have 50,000 people. So what about in our situation where we have a really complex situation? And in software, where we used to measure, that's not a very good measure, but we used to measure complexity of a software by lines of code, right? So we're thinking, okay, let's find a really difficult problem, a really complex problem where this works, because if we can show that it works there, it's usually also working in easier situations. The other side around is more difficult to explain. So we're looking at all kinds of different software. We turn the light on real quick. All kinds of different software. And we found, for example, here Linux. So Linux has 50 million lines of code. Android has 12 million, I think it is. World of Warcraft, 6 million. So we analyzed all this software. And when suddenly we found the Saab Gripen, a fighter jet. And you might say, well, Fabian, are you crazy? You're talking about lines of code, and now you're talking about a fighter jet? Yes, indeed, I do, because if you look at the Saab Gripen has more lines of code than World of Warcraft and Android Huntos together. So the Saab Gripen is a fighter jet, as I said. It has tons of code, and that's only the software part. It also has all the hardware part to it. So I think we can agree that this is a very complex jet, or a very complex product. So let's look at the Saab Gripen and how it compares to other fighter jets, and how do they do the scaled daily Scrum there. Now let's first compare a little bit the different project types. I know that they're not totally comparable, but like to get an idea. So I'm pretty sure you have heard about the F-35 project. This is a waterfall project. According to the information we got, the program cost in total by now is $1.5 trillion, and it's $168 billion over budget, and it has a cost increase by plane or per plane per jet from 273 million to 337 million. That is data from 2015. According to our last data, the final integration is delayed until 2022. There might be a different date now. And I'm sure at the end it will be an awesome jet. But if you look at the planning and the money invested and the time invested, it is not very successful because it's way over budget, way over time. Another interesting project was the F-22 Raptor update. So the F-22 Raptor is not in the complete development of the plane, it's just the update of that plane. So the update cost was 611 million. They used actually SAFE. And I'm pretty sure you know that according to the Scrum guide, you should deliver an increment at least at the end of each sprint, which is longest 1 month. They delivered their first increment after 3 years behind the actual plan, not 3 years in total, it's 3 years behind plan. And this increment only delivered 30% of the planned value. So in terms of, I'm not talking about the end result, but in terms of planning and what actually happens compared to the plan, both projects are not very successful. Now, if you use or look at the Saab Gripen, the program cost of the Saab Gripen is only $50 billion, which is less than the over budget of the F-35. And one plane only costs 43 million. And they're actually able to develop a complete new version of their product every 6 months. And according to Jane's Aviation Weekly, the Gripen is the world's most efficient fighter jet. What they're doing, they're using Scrum at scale. And obviously they use the scale daily Scrum. So how does it work? So at 7:30, each team does the daily Scrum. Now, if you look at this, then you will see you need to synchronize some stuff. You need to synchronize the sprints, for example, between each team. So they all need to have the same beginning of the sprint and the same end. And they also have to synchronize the times of their events. For example, each team has to do the daily Scrum at 7:30. Now at 7:45, they have the scale daily Scrum for the Scrum of Scrums, at 8 for the Scrum of Scrums, 8:15 Scrum of Scrums, and at 8:30 each day, the executive action team meets, and they're actually able to synchronize 2,000 people at Saab, actually Saab Defense, not Saab. And I thought I'd show you a little clip about the Saab Gripen, very short one.
I think we lost audio.
Yeah, we're not hearing anything. So we're not hearing any audio just in case we're supposed to. I think he's frozen.
The video is running, but
He looks frozen.
through.
Okay, I thought that's enough. But I don't know if you've seen that engine change in 1 hour in a fighter jet. I can't even do that in my car. So that's a pretty good product. Now, what you see at the right is again the result or the total framework Scrum at scale. So if you look at this, this is really lightweight, but I have to say it also has a disadvantage, because if you have something that lightweight, it has to adjust and adapt to your situation, to your context, which means there's no recipe. And that makes some sense because each company, each context is different, but some people don't like that. Some people want the recipe. And if you want the recipe, Scrum at Scale is probably not for you. But if you want high performance, in my opinion, Scrum at Scale is the best scaling framework that you could use. Okay, so with that, I would like to say thank you very much. If you would like to stay in contact, we can connect on LinkedIn, or you also can write me an email. And I think we still have a few minutes for questions if you have any.
All right, Marcelo, you seen anything in the chat for questions? Well, great job. Any questions in the chat, Marcelo?
No, I'm not seeing anything. Any
So,
questions?
so we can open up the mics, guys. If we have any questions right now, this is the time to ask. I have a ton, but if I start talking, you guys are not gonna.
Okay, we have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let me know if you can hear us. So Fabian, again, thank you so much for going through that overview. That was actually very simple and easy to understand. The questions are, can you walk us through the examples of what would be the inputs and the outputs of one or two of these Scrum of Scrums as you scale up? What would be some of the inputs and some of the outputs, examples of scenarios?
Yeah, so this is actually a pretty good question for the following reason. There's something I haven't mentioned. So you have to look at the Scrum Master scaling cycle separate from the product owner scaling cycle. The Scrum Master scales up and the product owner scales down. So what does it mean? The Scrum Master has its daily Scrum, for example, at the team level, and at the daily Scrum, they're talking about impediments. So they try to solve those impediments at their level, but if they can't, they scale this impediment to the next level, or they escalate it, let's say better in terms of, it's not called scaling, they escalate it to the next level. And then they try to solve that at this level. Now, if they can't, then they scale it to the next level. And that way, the impediment goes up until the executive action team. It's obviously important that the executive action team are high-level executives. So you don't want to go there and tell them that your laptop is not working. That is an impediment you want to solve on a lower level. But we have done work with Drum and Energy in gas drilling in Colombia, implementing Scrum at Scale. And they get so much faster. For those that have a little bit an idea about oil and gas, they get the drilling time for one well in average from 19 days to 6 days on average, only by applying Scrum at Scale. And what the major factor here was the executive action team resolving impediment each day. So that's what comes out of the daily Scrum when it goes up. Just to complete, the product owner scales down. That means like the vision comes from the top and then it has to scale down to the team level backlog.
Thank you. One of the things that we've seen a lot in the Scrum of Scrums is that we also have other key stakeholders like support leaders that support the Scrum Masters and support the teams, right? That support some of like the architecture and all of that. So they are also impediment removers that we escalate to, that the Scrum Masters escalate to. So have you seen in this framework that they also participate in the Scrum of Scrums? Because those are folks that might be fixing a lot of the issues for the teams and removing impediments for the teams that the Scrum Masters go to. Do they participate in these sessions as well?
Well, technically they could, but I think we have to first make sure that it's really an impediment we're talking about and not dependencies. We found that in many cases, the real problem are dependencies. And then one team is working on something that depends actually on some architecture or some stuff that another team is working on. And then we would actually solve a part that we would solve in the product owner cycle.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you.
I was curious when you talked about moving things up from a Scrum Master perspective, you talked about impediments. Can you also say moving up opportunities as well? Because maybe we went faster than and we want to share that. So maybe if it's some other factor. Hey, we've gone faster. Maybe we want to pivot. Maybe we want to adjust. Do you see that also as something that could be moved up?
Yeah, definitely, Rick. And I have to say, like, I had here maybe 10 or 15 minutes to talk actually about Scrum at scale and to make that in more detail, or to talk about it in more detail, to explain that in a better way. It still needs more time. It's a lightweight framework, but you can't explain that in 15 minutes. Now, what you would try to do is you have something that is called cross-team coordination, and that's where you try to do that. So if one team finds something that makes them really fast, we obviously want other teams to do the same. And there's a mechanism in Scrum at scale to spread that across teams. But you could also scale that in a daily Scrum. If you found something that you think, hey, they should know that immediately, you could do that.
Awesome. What large companies are doing this? Well, who would you refer, saying, look, this big company's doing this and successfully?
Okay, let me try one thing. Let's see if he's in the picture. There are several, but I have one case I really would like to highlight. Just let me see if I can find them here in the picture. I don't see him. Okay, so here's the thing. The most famous case study I think I've heard of using SAFe is John Deere. That was one of the first big case studies there. And when we went to Boston, we had a person from John Deere there, and he said in his part of the company, they're putting Scrum at scale. They use a little bit different vocabulary because people are apparently now a little bit resistant to more changes. But they're basically putting Scrum at scale over it. They're keeping using the SAFe terminology, but they're actually doing Scrum at scale in that area now, and they have seen performance improvements that are like 9 times, not percent, 9 times what they had before. So I don't know what was the improvement that SAFe did to John Deere, but let's say there was an improvement of X. So what Scrum at scale did to that was 9 times that. So that's, I think, a pretty interesting example.
Yeah, and as Fabian already knows, it's not famous, but it's my personal experience, because before it was called Scrum at Scale, that's what I used to scale Scrum where I worked making medical devices here in Miami. And it wasn't called Scrum at Scale at the time. You know, I just listened to some stuff that Jeff had written a long time ago and started thinking, well, how would I do this? And I tried it, you know, and all these years later, well, it's now called Scrum at Scale. So there you have it.
So he should have gotten all the credit. Remember that, Marcelo.
Say missed opportunity.
No, I don't get all the
Got in
credit. No, it was a talk that he gave in 2005, you know, and so, but the point is that, you know, this stuff does work, you know.
Awesome. Do we have any other questions? Let's give some other people a chance.
I have a question. So how is the Scrum of Scales planning session different than the SAFe PI planning session?
Okay. Well, first of all, in SAFe, you plan for a release train, and you plan for a longer time frame, which can be up to 3 months actually. And you have, I'm not sure if that is right what I say now, but it's several days actually. And what you want to do in Scrum at Scale is you would basically try to have one part of big room planning and then one part of small team planning, pulling from that backlog. It's not a complete different method. It's not completely different, but we want to plan for shorter time frames, because what we want is we want to have an increment at the end of each sprint. We don't want hardening sprints or test sprints or 3 month cycles without delivering anything. So it's not different in terms of what you do. It's probably more different in terms of what time frame you do it. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Can I ask one question, Fabian?
Go ahead.
Here in the Scrum at Scale, we have multiple business models going on, coexisting, and they sort of rely on each other. So I assume each one would have their own train, but a corporation has a mega plan that spans beyond one particular business model. So how would they coordinate different trains, or how is the role, or what is the role of a business owner in terms of like global overview for the company?
You mean to clarify? Let's see if I understand that correctly. You mean what is the role of let's say you have a business unit, and what's the role of the head of the business unit in Scrum at Scale, or?
Yeah, role of the business owners, how they coordinate, and how the different trains would connect with each other. And some trains coming from different models may have different release schedule than others, but still some they need to coordinate. So how would they coordinate when it comes to release?
Okay, let's see if I got that right. So first of all, in Scrum at Scale, we don't have release trains. Okay, we organized it around Scrum of Scrums, or Scrum of Scrum of Scrum. So that's how we call these units. But at the end, it's just a group of people, let's say. It's split up into groups. Now, what we use to coordinate are value streams. So we usually try to do that per value stream. So we have Scrum of Scrum of Scrum of Scrums, depending on how big the product of that value stream is. And they coordinate inside their value stream. So to not use the very big words. So let's say we have one Scrum of Scrum working on one value stream and one Scrum of Scrum working on another value stream. Each Scrum of Scrum has 5 teams to create an example. So inside their value stream, they obviously would coordinate when to release. And ideally, that I always try to release faster than slower. But in many cases, not even necessary to coordinate between those two value chains when they release, particularly when they're completely different products.
Sure.
So what you want to avoid is unnecessary coordination. Obviously, you always need some kind of coordination, but you don't want to have, let's say what you don't want is, you don't want to have waterfall over Scrum teams, because then you didn't win anything.
Right. Yeah, you don't want to mix both of them, but there may be individual instances of coexistence of waterfall as well as agile. Because as a business owner or a stakeholder is interested in the revenue coming from different business line, different products, and the responsibility eventually falls on the business owner, and business owner would be looking at the release train. What did it deliver? Did it deliver in time? Did it integrate with some?
I think I got your point. Like obviously there's an executive meta Scrum where the high level executives responsible for each value chain talk to each other, where they assign budgets, for example, to each value chain, and see revenues on that, and where they prioritize. So you have this is called in Scrum at Scale executive meta Scrum, but it does exist.
Awesome.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else that has a question?
Well, I want to throw out a thought. It's not as much a question. So the impression I'm getting is that a lightweight framework, as opposed to a heavy one that's has a big recipe. Lightweight actually supports the concept of agile. Where heavyweight, you're now moving away from agile. What's your reaction to that?
I think, Paul, that's a pretty good summary. I think what we want are lots of small teams that are as independent as possible, but still coordinated. So if you want to compare it, if you have a really big battleship with, I don't know how many people are on a battleship, let's say 10,000 people, I invented, I have no idea. And now, if you want to turn this battleship around, that will take a while. But if you have those 10,000 people on small speedboats all coordinated in the same direction, they can turn around way faster and still the same 10,000 people. So I think that's a pretty good summary, Paul. I couldn't say that better.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. Anyone else? Do you use Kanban at all in that scale?
Well, the only thing we sometimes steal from Kanban is the board.
Board.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Don't tell them, they'll get upset.
All right.
Everybody steals the board from Kanban.
All right. So thank you very much, Fabian. I want to make sure I give you a lot of great job.
Yeah.
So, Marcelo, you were about to say something, sir?
Yeah, no. I appreciate everybody that came out. You know, there's a whole lot more to say about this. And this is the part where I mean, I'm gonna ask Fabian to forgive me because I'm gonna pimp him out. We have a class for the Scrum at Scale practitioner. It's actually up on Eventbrite right now. It's tentatively set for the last weekend. That's right. It's the weekend of Black Friday in the United States right now. It just went up. We're still kind of playing with the date, but you know, we're going to make it A, affordable, B, engaging, C, you won't be bored, and I'll assure you, you will be able to apply this regardless of what you're currently using. So if you're using SAFe, you'll be able to use some of this stuff. If you're using Kanban, you'll be able to use some of this stuff. If you're used to using plain old Scrum, you will definitely be able to use this stuff. So we're hoping that you guys come in and you know, sign up for the class. And that's what I'm going to say. That's it. I'm done pimping out Fabian.